I was the second smallest boy in my high school freshman class. I didn't break the 5-foot mark until I was a sophomore. The only place where being small seemed like some kind of virtue was on the wrestling team, where I could fill the slot at 105 pounds. I'm twice the man I used to be. Anyway, there I was on the freshman wrestling team, whipped up into a frenzy of competitive spirit as we had our first wrestling match of the year against our arch rivals, Eau Claire North. And my opponent at 105 was named Steve, oddly enough. Steve Shea, or Steve S., in fact. He happened to be president of his freshman class, just like I was president of my freshman class. Same weight, same name, even had dark hair like I did way back when. He was like my parallel universe self. He was Bizarro Steve. You know, the one born on the wrong side of town and going to the bad school. I was wrestling my evil twin. So anyways, I came out with a fury, or as much fury as a freshman boy 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighing 105 pounds can muster. I was leading my evil twin 12-0 when I pinned him around the 4-minute mark. I crushed him. It just so happened that we wrestled again mid-season. I had lots of confidence going in based on our first meeting, and I defeated my doppelganger 11-1, a major victory in wrestling terms. I didn't pin him, however. The killer instinct just wasn't there the way it had been the first time. At the end of the season, we met for a third and final time. In the interim, he and I had been together at a leadership conference, and I had gotten to know him. Really a nice guy, as it turned out. I was barely leading 4-3 in the third period when, how do I put this? You know how when you're all doing sit-ups in gym class and somebody succumbs to digestive pressures, if you know what I mean? That's what happened to Steve S. Near the end of our wrestling match, and of course we both lost it completely, and we giggled our way through the rest of the match. Each of us received an official warning for stalling from the referee. Sometimes winning and losing doesn't seem so important. That's how it ended up with Steve S. I didn't want to fight him. I didn't need to wrestle him. In those days, I needed to wrestle with myself, my shadow self, my feelings of being small and insignificant. Do you know that that's what some folks think that Jacob was doing in our Old Testament reading this morning? That he was wrestling with himself, or at least wrestling with the kind of dark side image of himself? Others think that Jacob was wrestling with an angel of the Lord. Most scholars think that Jacob was wrestling with God, God's self. I think he may have been wrestling with all three at the same time, and winning and losing wasn't the point of his wrestling match either. To the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. That's from our epistle reading this morning that she just read. It formed the centerpiece of Reverend Dr. Carl Kuhn's sermon last Sunday. He commented how John the Seer took these royal and military metaphors and made them radically democratic and dedicated to the pursuit of peace and justice. The throne that Jesus talks about is one I had never imagined before, a throne that has a seat for everyone. Everyone who are part of the faithful who join Jesus. And the conquest he urges on us is the same kind of conquest that he himself achieved, a triumph of love, of forgiveness, mercy, and peace. We're invited to be conquerors like Jesus was a conqueror. He didn't defeat armies. He didn't win. He didn't capture territories. He didn't amass wealth and fame and political power. His conquest is not about winning and losing, but about the struggle for peace, for harmony, for justice. Peter Marty wrote an interesting column recently urging us to abandon military metaphors when we talk about dealing with disease, particularly cancer. Far and away, he writes, the favorite metaphor for addressing cancer involves the language of combat. One's body is the battlefield. The fight becomes one of total war. Marty adds that sometimes we speak of the deceased as someone who lost the battle with cancer. Marty sees this as problematic for a couple of reasons. First, it leaves us with only one of two possible outcomes, victory or defeat, when we deal with disease. And death becomes, as he puts it, the personal failure of those patients who evidently didn't fight valiantly enough. Secondly, warrior language falsifies the true nature of the disease, making it appear to bend or bow to patients who demonstrate special resolve and conquer those who don't. Do you see how depicting cancer in this way can be at least unhelpful and at most downright cruel? Instead, he suggests that a better alternative to this military language would be to understand it as a struggle, like climbing a mountain or winning a half marathon or spending 4 wet days in the wilderness in Minnesota. It's not so much a fight as it is a struggle. We don't win or lose. We struggle to face the challenge set before us. Think for a minute of Jacob wrestling through the night in our Old Testament reading. That wasn't a fight. It was an exhausting struggle. Whether he was contending with God or with some dark side of his own past, there was no clear victor or loser, and there wasn't going to be. All we learn in the aftermath of Jacob's struggle is that he walked away limping but blessed. He came face to face with God through his struggle and walked away with a new identity. Maybe you've noticed our worship theme for the year in the banner outside the front door or on the front of our bulletin covers. If you hear my voice, that's our theme for the program year. It's from that verse in Laodicea where Christ says, I am standing at the door knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come into you and eat with you and you with me. Well, what I'm suggesting this morning is that when we listen for the voice of Christ, these are the people we want to hear. People who have struggled. We're not looking for the winners, bragging about their success, telling us how they followed the 4 rules of wealth acquisition, or the 5 stages to perfect happiness, or the 10 steps to cleaner and whiter teeth, for that matter. Life isn't a win-lose proposition. It's about the struggle. And those of us who have tasted the kind of conquest that Christ experienced are those who have struggled. Last Sunday, we heard from Reverend Dr. Carl Kuhn, who you clearly heard is engaged in a lifelong struggle with scriptures. That's a wrestling match. Next month, we're going to hear from Mark Charles, a nationally known speaker, a Navajo Christian who is running as an independent for President of the United States right now. His struggles for truth and justice for the native peoples of our land is both personal and prophetic, and we're going to hear from him. Members of our congregation and families with children having special challenges and offering special blessings will be sharing their voices with us in the Sunday prior to Christmas. Reverend Kerry Parker, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches, will be arriving in January with an ecumenical delegation of youth to share their witness against gun violence. In February, our Lenten season will be devoted to hearing the voices of women in Scripture, voices too seldom heard and heeded, voices born out of their own struggles. And at the end of March, Reverend Dr. Alan Hilton will join us to talk about his work with A House United, those churches who are resisting the trend towards political, religious segregation. and are trying to find a way to honor diversity in political opinion in church through respectful listening and bold dialogue. These are the voices that we're going to be hearing in this next year as we try to hear the voice of Jesus in the midst of our own struggles. Just as John the Seer invited those Laodicean Christians to keep strong in their struggle with Roman imperialism, the voice of Christ is urging us today to be someone who never gives up in the struggle for peace, to be a church that never stops resisting injustice, to be a part of a business that continues to ask how it can be of service to the community, to be a part of a family that continues to work at understanding its identity and mission, both as individuals and as a family. William Sloane Coffin liked to tell the story of an old campaigner against injustice who went on a hunger strike during the Reagan administration in protest over cuts in funding for those providing services to the homeless and the mentally ill. This man was in his 80s when he declared his hunger strike. And his friends each took turns visiting him and begging him to stop. "I worry about your health," Coffin told his old friend. "And your hunger strike, let's be honest, isn't going to change anything." His friend replied, "Some things you do to change the world, other things you do so the world doesn't change you." That's who I can hear Jesus from, in that old man's insistence to struggle with injustice and against short-sighted and self-interested policies that neglect the poor and needy. That's the persistent knocking that I can hear. I hear it in the voices of those who remembered Reverend Maynard Beamer this last week, talking about how he seemed indestructible and forever young because he kept struggling against apathy and despair, struggling to inspire all of us when we were ready to give up in the fight to be a better community, a better church, and better people. I hear it listening to the faith statements of this year's confirmands as they reflect back and embrace the words that we say about being open and affirming, loving and inclusive. And their words commit us to continue the struggle to truly be all those things we say we are. I hear it in the witness of those who are in recovery, not recovered, but recovering, understanding that life is a struggle to be faced one day at a time. I hear it from those who are parent or spouse, child or friend, who understand that those roles are not just a blessing, but a struggle, from which on occasion we limp away. We are being invited to be conquerors like Jesus was a conqueror, and he struggled. He struggled with evil. He struggled with injustice. He struggled to be faithful to a calling of peace and mercy, love and forgiveness. He struggled as we too must struggle, so that the words of the old hymn will come true in us. No more we doubt the glorious Prince of Life. Life is naught without thee. Aid us in our strife. Make us more than conquerors through thy deathless love. Bring us safe through Jordan to thy home above. Thine is the glory, risen, conquering Son. Endless is the victory thou o'er death hast won. Amen.